Welcome back, everybody. My name is Tucker, and as many of you know, the All-NBA teams were announced yesterday as of this recording. And in this video, I just want to talk about something that I believe is a huge issue with these All-NBA teams and how they're selected and what they affect. And it might not be exactly what you're thinking of at first. And as always, when these kinds of things are announced, whether it's All-Star, All-NBA, All-Defensive, any of these awards or any of these teams, a lot of the discussion is around who did and did not make each team. Some of the ones that were highlighted yesterday were Nikola Jokic making first team at the center spot over Joel Embiid, and LeBron James making the third team, but that's really not what I'm concerned with. So for those of you that don't know, the way that this All-NBA selection process goes is there's a large panel of global sports writers and broadcasters that give their votes for first, second, and third team All-NBA. That corresponds to a certain number of points among the guard, forward, and center positions. And as always with these kinds of subjective ranking systems, there's going to be issues with it. There's going to be flaws. It's not going to be perfect, and there's always ways that you can tweak it. And again, that's what a large amount of the conversation has been about, but that's not what I'm concerned with. The bigger issue here for me is not who was selected, how they were selected, where they placed on each team. It's how these teams, how the subjective ranking system affects contract values and free agency decisions around the league. And of course, I'm talking about Supermax contracts and how these contracts and how players that become eligible for these contracts affect their decisions and just affect the league as a whole in a huge way. And by extension, because these All-NBA teams are a part of how a player becomes eligible for a Supermax, which I'm going to talk about in a second, they have a huge impact on team payrolls and free agency and all this stuff, and that just doesn't seem right to me. Now, this also extends to MVP and Defensive Player of the Year and other award stuff like that, but obviously the All-NBA teams affect the most players because there's the most players on the team, so that's what I'm focused on today. But really quickly, let's just talk about what a Supermax contract is. If a player becomes eligible for a Supermax contract, and I'll put that criteria up on screen, they become eligible for a max contract that is much bigger than they typically would have if they were not eligible for it. Now, it's relatively specific how you become eligible for these kinds of deals, but the point of this was to try and make it easier for teams to bring back their own free agents by allowing them to offer much more money than a team could on the open market. And honestly, and this is kind of a video that I like to do in the future, and this is stepping on it a little bit, but Supermax contracts in general are kind of an issue because they end up being more of a hindrance than they are a benefit more often than not, obviously with players like Russell Westbrook and John Wall, given their injury issues and given their age. But again, that's not really what I want to talk about in this video. The bigger issue for me is that we're leaving these decisions that are worth tens of millions of dollars up to these broadcasters and sports writers that might have their own individual agendas and honestly might not be taking the process all that seriously. With all due respect to these players, here are some of the guys that received votes for All-NBA teams this year. These are players that these individual broadcasters and sports writers, whoever was a part of this panel, thought were some of the best players in the league at their respective positions. Lou Williams, Eric Gordon, Marvin Bagley, Domantas Sabonis, Miles Turner, and Dwayne Wade. Now, I know that there's going to be some of you that are going to go down in the comments section and try to explain to me why some of these votes were justified, but let's just be honest with ourselves. It's a joke that some of these guys received votes over some much more worthy players. And just think about it for a second. What if Kemba Walker didn't make All-NBA third team this year because of the votes that were just thrown at Dwayne Wade and Eric Gordon and Lou Williams, costing him tens of millions of dollars on his next contract? Because he is one of the players that had a lot of money on the line with these All-NBA teams being announced in terms of possibly being eligible for a Supermax deal this summer. And again, what if those throwaway votes had been the reason that he didn't make third team All-NBA and caused him to not be eligible for a Supermax, causing him to leave Charlotte because they couldn't offer him so much more money than everybody else? That's a huge deal that these teams can have such a big impact on free agency decisions, and as a result, on the league as a whole. As increasingly over the last 5 or 6 years, that's been a huge way that the league has been changing in terms of where talent is going, how teams are attracting free agents has been one of the biggest ways that they've been able to improve from year to year, and this is having a huge impact on those decisions. Now, for Kemba's situation specifically, I'm not sure that that would actually happen, but just the fact that it's a possibility under the system is absolutely terrifying. And sticking with Walker for a second, by him making an All-NBA team this year, by this system, we're saying that he is worth a ton more money, like tens of millions of dollars worth more money than players like Bradley Beal and to a certain extent Klay Thompson as well, because he was voted in the guard category ahead of them. You can have that individual debate if you want to. It's not really about where you rank each of those three players in the guard hierarchy. It's just the gigantic difference in the value of the contract that Kemba is going to be able to sign compared to those two guys. Now, this most directly affects Klay because he's going to be a free agent this summer, and if he had made an All-NBA team, he, just like Kemba, would have gotten a huge boost in what he could have been able to earn this summer because he's being named to an All-NBA team immediately prior to the summer in which he's eligible for a new contract. But is it realistic to think that someone like Walker is worth that much more money on an annual basis compared to players like Thompson and Beal? Probably not. And that also gets into this whole conversation about how the All-NBA teams are split up between guards, forwards, and centers, as if the talent around the league is equally split between those three groups of positions. Like, who's to say that 8 of the top 12 players in the league can't be guards or forwards or in some other random universe centers as well? It doesn't make any sense to split these things up by position when they're also affecting contract values, because it's assuming that all of the talent is equally distributed across those multiple positions when we all know that that's not the case. And this has been a thing in the past as well. Gordon Hayward, going back to his days in Utah, could have been able to sign a much bigger contract to stay with the Jazz than the one that he signed when he left to go play for the Celtics if he had made an All-NBA team in the season immediately before he became a free agent. And obviously that's on him to play well enough to just guarantee himself a spot on the All-NBA teams. But that's just such a huge impact for these kinds of decisions to have on the league that if he did end up making that team and they did vote him, then he probably would still be in Utah. And that just changes so much about the last couple of years in the NBA based solely off the fact that he did not get enough votes to be a third-team All-NBA player in that specific year. And also, speaking of players that were closely eyeing these All-NBA teams in terms of their contract potentially being much bigger as a result of being on these teams, it actually would have helped the Portland Trail Blazers in terms of their payroll moving forward if Damian Lillard somehow didn't make an All-NBA team this year. And the fact that that is something that would have helped them shows you how much of an issue this current system is, and that it really isn't a good one. Now, I understand that there's only really occasional scenarios in which this is a big issue, but I just don't understand why these two things, All-NBA selections and contract values, need to be tied together. Now, I understand that there are contracts that have incentives in them tied to All-NBA teams and awards races, but typically they're relatively small amounts compared to the difference between a regular max contract and a Supermax contract. And really, shouldn't the deciding factor in terms of how much a player is worth on their next contract be the decision of the teams around the league and how they value that player, how they value their skill set, and how much money they are willing to offer that individual player? Why is that decision being made for them, again, by this panel of sports writers and broadcasters? And really, I don't even have that much of an issue with the Supermax contract in general, even though I think over time we're going to realize that it's not a sound investment to allocate that big of a percentage of the salary cap to one individual player. But if this is how we're going to decide contract values with this voting system, why stop there? Why don't we just say, hey, if you reach a certain statistical threshold over the full season, then you're eligible for this much bigger of a contract than if you don't? This whole system just makes no sense. And again, I don't really care about All-NBA teams. I mean, it creates a conversation, which is nice, and some people use them as a way to compare one player over another historically, and if you're going to do that, that's fine, but I think we should also probably understand that this is a subjective voting system that we're using as an argument for one player over another. So again, I don't really care that much about who does and doesn't make All-NBA teams until it has this big of an impact on contract values and team payrolls long term, and how it affects individual teams' abilities to bring in free agents in terms of having salary cap space because they have to allocate so much money to a Supermax player, or having that cap space because some guy decided they weren't eligible or shouldn't have been on an All-NBA team, and so then they don't have to pay them as much. And it's just way too much power for this panel and for this voting system to have when it's not a perfect system. And again, I don't really have an issue with how these players are selected. You can pick them however you want. I don't really care. It just shouldn't have this big of an impact, this $80 million impact on how much players can make on their new contract. All you have to do is just separate the two. Don't let All-NBA selections decide who is and is not eligible for a Supermax contract. If you want to keep the Supermax, that's fine. Players that have been in the league for a certain amount of time, a certain number of years, can be eligible for a bigger max contract than other players, but let the individual teams decide if they want to give a player that much money rather than letting this panel of sports writers and broadcasters decide whether that player is worth it for the franchise. But let that be their decision. Don't let this imperfect voting process that we all recognize has flaws be a way that we decide how much more money a player can make compared to another player, when really it should be the individual team's decision on how much they want to pay a player underneath all the other restrictions that we have for NBA salaries across the league. And there you have it. That's just kind of my ranty opinion on how stupid it is that all NBA teams impact contract values. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.